So Ecclesiastes chapter 3, up to this point, what are some things that you're remembering? Whether it's a phrase or what are some things that you're remembering?
Meaningless.
Meaningless meaning. Some translations say futile. Some say, I forgot what the third one was. Vanity. What? Anything else that you recall so far? What's going to be important is the phrase "under the sun." Remember, what does under the sun mean?
Material, carnal.
Okay, it's our existence on this planet. Okay, it's human existence and nothing else. Okay, the subject at hand today is going to be one which I don't have all the answers for, but it is something that we do need to wrestle with. And so this is also going to play a part in this Sunday sermon. It's weird how these things are kind of connecting. But what we're looking at significantly today is the sovereignty of God. Now there's two ways for this passage, or in particular, verses 1 through 9, or 1 through 8 to be interpreted because it is a poem. There's two ways to interpret it. They kind of use the example of Jesus' parables, okay? Apart from Luke, the accounts in the Gospels were not meant to be chronological. Luke made it intentional to be chronological. That's the doctor in him, maybe the OCD in him. And so some people will say, well, the parables are kind of standalone. Interpret them, as an individual parable, not in the context of the passage of Scripture. I'm not so much on that side of the scope, but that's how some people view the first 8 verses here. That maybe it needs to be interpreted by itself, not in the context of the things around it. However, we're not going to be doing that. But looking at it, if you were to interpret it the first way, so the first interpretation is going to be more of a man-centered one, where it's interpreted in this way, that human beings have to be discerning of the times and place that they are in. And so this can lead us to subscribe, and this is the error, to subscribe to a theology which places us at the center of human events. Almost as though we make decisions and we can leave God scrambling to fulfill His will in light of our actions. We saw that play a lot into the last series that we did, where you could blow God off of His throne if you have too much faith kind of stuff. It was a very little God. And so the first approach can lead you down that kind of route. The second approach, the second interpretation, is putting God at the center. So the issue is no longer human timing, but God's activity and the human response to it. With God at the center, God controls, and humans cannot change which God has set in motion, meaning we cannot manipulate or change His divine will. This is where we've got to wrestle with His sovereignty. Okay, how does this play out? We do subscribe to free will. Well, how does that play out if God is sovereign? These are things we're going to need to wrestle with. So, a lot of our focus is going to be on verses 1 through 8. I have prepared some comments for the verses that follow. Understand, I may not have all the answers. I know that sounds crazy. So, could I please have someone read the full chapter for me? And then would there be somebody who'd be willing, Randy, would you read the verse by verse when we go through them?
Yeah.
And who would read the full chapter for us? Why'd you look at her first? He's like, anybody? Yeah. All right, Les is going to read the full chapter, and then we'll start breaking it down a little bit more.
There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to uproot. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to tear down, and a time to build. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones, and a time to gather them. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search, and a time to give up. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear, and a time to mend. A time to be silent, and a time to speak. a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Whatever it is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. And I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward, and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their life. For whoever can bring them to who can bring them to see what will happen after them?
All right. Anything jump out to you? We're going to be focusing a lot on verses 1 through 8. Anything jump out there?
There's appropriate behavior for every circumstance.
Looking at the first one, looking at verse 2, the first part of verse 2, because he's establishing this repetition of a time. A time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. And it becomes kind of monotonous, but he does set up essentially an account of contrasting things that there is a particular time for. Okay? The very first one I found was very interesting. Notice that Solomon begins the most irrefutable truth of the sovereignty of God. We have no control over when we are born or when we die. And so since you've all been born, the question is, does the thought of having no say in our death due to the sovereignty of God scare you or liberate you?
Yes.
Peace.
What's that?
I said, I think it gives me peace. I was just talking to my husband about this the other day, about how that God is sovereign and over every single thing, that we know that it's going to work out perfectly just the way that He wants, even our deaths. It's going to work out the way that He wants it to.
And so you said yes to both, okay? Dive into that a little bit.
It's scary in that we don't know our fate. And it's an uncertain thing. You wonder, it's not the fact that you die, it's how you die.
Yeah.
How much pain you're going to go through before you get to that point. Everybody experiences the same, but let's face it, if you have a long, ongoing illness versus, a sudden car wreck, it's completely different.
Yeah, R.C. Sproul said, I'm not afraid to die, I'm afraid how to die.
It's just like if you fall off a real large building, it's not the fall, it's the sudden stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
We live as if we do have say there.
We do.
Because, I'm going to stop eating, a whole cake every night because that's going to have a negative impact on me.
Well, have fun with that. I'm not.
I drive, 150 mile an hour down the interstate.
Have fun with that. I'm not.
But we do live as if we do have, some level of control. We know that ultimately God.
It's very interesting because what popped into my head was the person who's like, yeah, I've smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day for 80 years and I'm 100 years old.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you had the good lottery. God wouldn't call you till you were 102 and whatever. It's like, no matter, even with your best efforts, it wasn't going to sabotage it. It's interesting.
And whichever verse it was, it mentions, he put the eternity, the thought of eternity in the heart of man, and yet we know we're mortal. It also lets you know that there's something more to strive for. This isn't all there is. And I know he keeps saying it's meaningless, it's meaningless, it's meaningless, but it's not meaningless because this is not all there is.
Yeah. And so here's where we wrestle. Because we're interpreting this within the text, it puts it at a God-centered interpretation. And as I said, we subscribe that there is in fact free will, but Proverbs 16:33, I think, helps us kind of understand this a little bit more. Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." And it's this, even God is not removed from it. It's in our hand. We throw it, but it's going to land where He wanted it to land for His will. And so one of the things, I haven't really dove into it, but one of my friends who, he's got a YouTube channel, we kind of dialogue back and forth a little bit, and he talked about a thing called Molinism, which is it's an attempt to kind of explain free will along with the sovereignty of God, whereas you have Arminianism, which is just full-blown free will kind of stuff, and then you have Calvinism, which is there's no free will. God does everything, so on. And so Molinism is kind of that in-between of human beings have free will, but God is also sovereign. And so he told me that, and I go, well, that technically, right off just looking at the cover of the book, it seems to fit where I'm at, but I want to look into it more. And so we cast the lots, but it lands according to His will. I mean, that's kind of we roll the dice, but He knows it's coming up 7 because His will wants it to come up 7. You see kind of where we're going with it?
The way if I argued with Calvinists, I used to love debating different things, So, predestination, yeah, it's right there. So you're predestined for hell until you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. You're predestined for hell.
I had good friends who were Calvinists, and I would just every chance I could, I'd just be like, you were just predestined to say that. Who cares? I told you the donut story, didn't I? It's not. No,
You can't live your life like that. I mean, you can't. I mean, as if you have no.
Well, here's where I have kind of an issue where you have the Reformed background, which is more the Calvinist background. They're becoming more and more evangelistic, which is ironic because you have no say in who is saved anyway. Yet, you're pushing evangelism pretty hard. Well, it can only be because obedience. Jesus tells us to do it. But how silly is that to just go out and do the puppet dance even though you know you have no impact on what's going on?
But you're predestined to go out and do that.
Exactly. And so they were awesome guys. And to be honest with you, as far as Calvinism is concerned, predestination, it rarely comes up within preaching, within teaching. It's such a small part of it, you really don't notice it. But when it hits, it's there. So, but I worked alongside them, and it was a lot of fun because we would give each other guff.
Were they Baptist or Presbyterians?
Baptist.
Okay, I think that's part of the reason they're becoming more evangelistic. That was a Presbyterian primarily, and that's kind of migrated into the Baptist church.
Yeah.
I don't think they really know what to do with that.
They don't know what to do with their hands. Another thing that jumped out with the second part of verse 2, it says a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. I like this because it's obviously agricultural, okay? You throw the seed, you harvest, but there's also another element to it. It's not just a reaping, a sowing, and so on, but it also is a weeding out the things that you don't want there. And I think if we kind of think about our own lives and think about, for example, the traits we see kind of growing up, and the Holy Spirit wants to pull those weeds, to remove those weeds. There's a season. There's a time for it. There's a time where the Holy Spirit is working in us and sanctifying us and removing the things that are destructive, or removing the character traits that we've got to really begin wrestling with. And so it really paints this picture of, look, there's a time to enjoy the harvest, and then there's a time to work. There's a time to plant, and there's a time to uproot.
That's a positive and a negative.
Yes. That's the reoccurring thing in the poem here. Another interesting thing is verse 3. It says a time to kill and a time to heal. Well, this wouldn't be removed from the prohibition of murder. Okay, this wouldn't be that God has said, do not murder, and Solomon's like, you got to do what you got to do. It wouldn't be removed from them.
Some people just need killing.
Some people just need it, and so it can't. And so the commentators that I was reading through, they have a strong emphasis that this can't be removed from God's command that thou shalt not murder. So this has got to be functioning differently. Some could say that maybe this has to do with war. Some could say this, some could even go so far as to go this might have to do with maybe self-defense or something. But it's not I'm going to go out and start murdering people. There's a time you just got to murder folk. That's not what Solomon's saying.
Well, the law does command death in some instances too.
Yeah, and C.S. Lewis wrote a lot about that too. He said he fully expected, there's a lot of Germans, in World War II who were Christians, who were conscripted into service and had to fight. Mm-hmm. He said it's very, very possible, two Christians shot each other across the field of battle. Were they need to be judged for murder? No, because it was a kind of war. War was what was expected. Each was conscripted into service, just like in the U.S. or wherever. It's very possible to be in a war and sure, that's a time to kill, but that is not murder.
Yeah, if you're going to talk about Germany, I always think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. As a bold man, and I can't say that if I wouldn't give him the chance to take out Hitler, I wouldn't have tried. But fascinating guy. In the second part of verse 3, the first part is a time to kill, a time to heal. The second part of verse 3 is a time to tear down and a time to build up. So this is going to be speaking of a structure. And this could be regardless of the building project. You remember we talked about if somebody were to take in another family member, they would just add on to the house. They wouldn't put a different structure. So this could be a construction project where you've got to tear some down and build some up. But it also may mean an absolutely entire destruction. You just don't know. Verse 4.
A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance.
Anything jump out there?
Funerals and weddings.
Yeah. That fits a time to mourn and a time to dance. Just playing.
In a sense, this is just describing, life.
Yeah.
Saying, look, life is not going to be all, a bed of roses, and you're going to, even with, the birth and die and plant and all that, it's just, it's like, hey, life is going to happen, and it's, it's out of your control, or a lot of it is, and it's okay to be different.
Does this call back to anything we've covered previously in Ecclesiastes?
I don't know.
You're off the hook. It was him. We were like not showing up, huh? Chapter 1. We kind of talked about the sun going up, sun going down, talking about kind of how the earth just does its thing, and it's just completely, it could care less what you're going through. This is just the way it's going to function, right? And this is kind of what we're seeing with life is, you see both. You see both sides happening, and they're unavoidable. There's no way you're going to go through life and not have amazing experiences and also have very difficult and sorrowful times. The first part of verse 5.
Time to scatter stones and time to gather them.
What I found interesting with this was that oftentimes we see this in 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 19 and verse 25. 2 Kings 3, 19 and 25 is what they would do a lot of times in a siege process is they would throw stones onto the land to disrupt agriculture. If you're doing a large siege and you cover the fields with rocks, you're going to make it difficult to grow, right? And if you're trying to, and if it's a long one, trying to starve them out, not being able to grow things is kind of, or it could be a tactic to make it difficult so that they can't regain the power that you just took away. You took over their area, you took over their land, you don't want them to regain their strength too quick, so you go out and throw stones. And it's not like you threw a rock or two. Clearly, there's a lot of stones being thrown, but it inhibits the growth in that area. Okay, you're going to have to go in and remove the stones. Well, that takes time, and that's not going to allow them to gain up in power. Does that make sense? A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. I want us to read verse 6 again, but I want us to kind of read verse 6 in light of salvation. What comes to mind in God's salvation and His relationship with His people when we read verse 6? Go.
A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away.
The search for the one sheep.
Search for the one sheep.
Versus, they talk about, shake the dust off your feet.
Mm-hmm.
Chasing the crows before swine.
Okay. What translation do you have, Randy?
NIV 2011.
I do like how the NASB puts it, the first part of verse 6, as a time to search and a time to give up as lost. And thinking about salvation, that's probably one of the more terrifying things is, for example, the dusting off of your sandals. It's this is on you then. The time in which God, the door's closed. It's not happening. That's to give up what you, so if you think about the parable of the lost sheep, imagine a situation where I'm not going to find it.
Jesus told the disciples, when you go into the city, they're not going to listen to you, get the dust off your feet and move on.
Yeah. And so there's a time where there's a giving up. And that's the terrifying thing. That's the scary thing with it, because I see so many people investing so much time and so much energy, and one pastor put it this way, that the church spends countless hours, man hours, and money watering rocks. And he was looking at the parable of the sower. There's fertile soil that's there, but we spend so much time watering rocks. And that is very true.
But then you look at the case of Jonah, who did not want people who wasn't in his position. And all he did was, 30 days and y'all going to die. That was his sermon. That was it.
Worst, best sermon ever.
And he ends up saving the entire city, and he didn't want it saved. He wanted God to strike him dead.
Yeah. He's like, I'm going to sabotage this sermon. I never sabotaged a sermon before, but I have gone up and been like, wow, that didn't go anywhere as planned. And then, altar's full. And I'm like, all right, thanks for reminding me this isn't about me. Good deal. It doesn't matter how I communicate. It matters how you convict. Fantastic.
We water the rocks and hope that some miracle will happen.
And that's certainly true. I mean, if we go through the parable of the sower, we don't necessarily, our responsibility is to sow. Our responsibility is to throw it. God's the one who's going to grow it, okay? But we then go back, and we don't go to the fertile field. We go back with our water, our resources, our financial resource of the church, our time, our energy, and go, this rock, there's a seed here. I care about this seed a lot, but I'm going to water this rock, and what happens? It's still a rock. And so it is something that elders have to really weigh continuously, because you've got to make sure that you're investing your resources into the fertile soil, because 3 out of 4 of them are not going to bring forth anything. Well, you're not going to the Hall of Fame with that kind of batting average. 250 that there's fertile soil, that's a burden that weighs on you as a leader. Where's that fertile soil? Verse 7.
A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak.
Forget about that second part. I don't agree with it. The first part, now this may refer to a time of mourning where when somebody was in deep mourning, they tore their clothes. Or blasphemy, you saw this with the trial of Jesus. They tore their robes. Well, they didn't just go, well, that robe's gone. They would mend it. They'd sew it back up. It wasn't just you tore your clothes, that's it. And so this could very well be referring to maybe a situation like that. You tear it, but then you also need to sew it. Verse 8.
A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace.
So verses 1 through 8, what's your takeaway there? Anything jump out to you that you found interesting that we'd gone over? Or?
A time for everything.
There's a time for everything. And he covers an awful lot, does he not?
You look at some of these, they kind of go together, time to plant, uproot, tear down, build, the tear, time to sow. There are times that we've got to let situations or relationships or whatever you want to plug in there, fall apart. Go, in those versus, ones that we are going to keep and work out or whatever. You can plug in multiple things in there. Mm-hmm. But it's all about picking and choosing, or not necessarily choosing, but there are times that things aren't going to.
I know we've seen this in our life. We've been uprooted several times and sent places where we weren't expecting to go. But regardless of where we were or what we were doing, God used us in each and every place that we found ourselves in. And it was sometimes it takes us a while to find the purpose, and sometimes we didn't find it until after we already left there and gone somewhere else. You look back and say, "Oh, that's why."
Yeah.
But
at the time, you're like,
just like in your
why is
sermon,
it being torn apart?
Yeah.
From this past week, there was purpose.
Yeah.
I might see the reason, but there's purpose.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a very good point, Susan, with we've got to use discernment to know what time it is. We have to discern what time is it. If we're going into it's one of those it's a time to laugh and we're mourning, well, we didn't really discern it very well. There's a time for everything, and we have to be discerning as to what season are we in, what time are we in, and how can we be equipped to handle that time. But it also, there's people who, you see how it goes back and forth. Good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. Which can lead someone to go, well, if you're in a season of good, brace yourself, bad's coming. And if you're a season of bad, hold tight, because a good one's coming. And so there's an optimism and pessimism, that we can all find there. But we have to be discerning about the times that we are in. Any other input?
It makes me think of just Jesus and what he said, play the pipe for you and you didn't dance, sang a dirge and you didn't mourn because you failed to discern and realize what the situation was. Make sure they didn't read their wisdom literature, I guess.
Were you talking about like the people who said, Lord, we did all this stuff?
No, I think it was in Matthew 11 he says that. But they fail to realize what time it is, right?
Okay.
You can read the sky,
Yeah.
but you don't know what's happening right now. But
Look that up for me, because there's something I want to add, but if you can find that, bring it in. It kind of came to mind with those where he said, depart from me, I never knew you. And then there were those who said, Lord, when did we feed you? When did we visit you? Even though we're discerning of the season, we may not know what we're doing. We may not know, but we know that this is a time to do this. This is a time to respond this way. This is a time for us to go here. And yet it was kingdom work, if that makes sense. Did you find it, Randy?
I found it, yeah. To whom can I compare this generation? They're like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds.
And so had this been the case where they used their discernment to determine what time they were in, well, they would have recognized the Messiah, would they not? They would have recognized John the Baptist was paving the way. They would have recognized the Messiah is on his way. But they didn't. Absolutely right. Any other input? Any other things jump out to you? All right, did you recall anything as we were going through? If you could, Les, could you reread 9 through the rest and kind of have your ears up and let me know what jumps out to you?
What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear Him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward, and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will come, or what will happen after them?
All right, first things first, he said that we're like the animals. What's he speaking of there? Is this some evolutionary mumbo-jumbo he's talking about? What's he speaking about?
We have a temporary existence.
Mortality. Okay? There's no way to deny the fact that both animals and humans have the breath of life. Okay, we're alive. That's the way that works. But there's also very clear evidence we are set apart from the animals. However, one of the points that he is making is, well, what happens when an animal's time is up and our time is up?
Decay.
What's that?
We die and decay.
We die and decay. Maybe one of us might be a good cheeseburger, but we're both going to die, right? We're both going to return to dust. So he's not saying that there's no distinction between human beings and animals in that regard of God has obviously placed human beings above animals. We're created in His image, and nowhere in Scripture does it say that animals were created in His image. But what he is referring to is the mortality in which we possess. We're both going to die. We're both going to return to dust. We're just like the animals in that regard. Very negative, but it's also very true. What else jumped out in the passages or the verses that we read through just now?
What you said is true, but then he contrasts that in the beginning part of that, because he talks about how within humans there's that desire for eternity and the will to seek it, which sets you apart from the animals. So in many ways you're like an animal because, like you said, you're finite, but you're different because you can sense that there's something more and that you want to seek that. And
We know we're finite, but animals do not.
Yeah.
we have because we're made in God's image, we can see Him, and we can see and understand His eternal nature. And
It's interesting. Verses 12 through 13 says, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good, which is weird that that's coming up in Ecclesiastes. To do good? All right? To do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every person who eats and drinks sees good in all his labors. This is a gift of God. What came to mind was Ephesians 5:15 through 16. It says, "So then, be careful how you walk, not as unwise people, but wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil." Now, verse 16 in that passage is better translated, "Redeem your time." So it's better read, "So then, be careful how you walk, not as unwise people, but as wise. Redeem the most of your time, because the days are evil." It seems that Solomon is speaking similarly of the use of our time. That you have a set time, we're talking about the sovereignty of God, you have a time that you're going to be on this earth. Redeem that time. Use that time for His purpose, for His will, for His glory. To take that time and to use it otherwise is what we find running throughout Ecclesiastes, which is meaningless. Anything else jump out there?
Verse 11 is that God is sovereign verse. It's He made everything at the appropriate time. He was the one that put the eternity. It wasn't like we just came up with that, for such great people. He was, and the last part of that, where man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. That goes back to, God's ways are higher,
Is that, yeah, higher, yeah. You had me confused. Higher than our ways.
Yeah, you know that passage, right?
Better.
Better.
They're gooder than our ways.
And his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, or whatever that passage is. That's bad. I should actually know that scripture. But, it goes back to that. We are never going to know, everything that God's done and how everything pieces together.
Yeah.
But God does, and that's...
And that again goes back to last Sunday, where to search for the purpose is going to get you closer to that than to ask for the, look for the reason. Finding the purpose. And, last year wasn't the greatest year in the sense of, we uprooted, moved to Indiana. It didn't work out, had to uproot again. But you look back, and I had one of my best friend up there actually simplified it for me. He said, you went down to Florida, you left a church that you would have loved to serve at. In fact, the opportunity opened up the moment you left, so that meant that opportunity was gone. You can't leave and come back. That's not how that works. You go to Florida, you find Evelyn, you adopt her, you go to Indiana. Well, in Indiana, you create a GoFundMe, and several congregants covered your lawyer fees. He goes, say you went to Florida to adopt Evelyn, and you went to Indiana to pay for Evelyn, to cover the fees of it. He goes, isn't that worth it? I go, you're right. That's one purpose, because the Lord knows I didn't have the lawyer fees. But that's I'm sure I could dig deeper. That was good enough for me. That had a remarkable purpose of why to uproot, why to leave, why to give this girl a life with two Christian parents and a loving family, and now God has provided for us a church that just loves them to death. So that's a wonderful, I was perfectly fine with that purpose. I'm sure there's far more, but looking for the purpose is going to help us in those times of when he says there's a time for the bad. Asking and searching and seeking the purpose is going to be better off for us than to go, well, why is this happening? I mean, Ecclesiastes isn't really giving us good answers. The sun goes up, sun goes down. Sucks for you. I mean, that's not real helpful as far as Ecclesiastes is concerned, is it? But even in the midst of what he's going through and talking about with the time for this, he still talks about the time for laughter. He talks about the time for that relationship, the time for sowing, the time. It's not just the negative. And even Solomon knows that. Even in the midst of suffering, he knows that there's something right around the corner that is good. And he even says here, good. Rejoice and do good. Why? He's establishing there is a separation between good and evil. And it even goes further with that, with verse 16. He says, furthermore, I have seen under the sun. What is under the sun? Right here, right now, okay? I've seen under the sun, in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. So what's he seeing under the sun? What is he seeing? He's seeing a shift that this world has, the people have replaced justice and righteousness with wickedness. Has that changed? We haven't really found new ways to sin, have we? We keep doing the same old ones, and it still keeps eroding civilization. He says, so he acknowledges that there is justice, that there is righteousness that exists. But that's being replaced with wickedness. But it doesn't change the fact that righteousness and justice exist. And this is why it's so important that we really understand the character and nature of God, because there's a lot of times where we pull away and want to emphasize His love, and by doing so, we sacrifice His justice. Well, you can't do that, because this is who He is. You can't emphasize His love and sacrifice His justice. He is loving. He is just. In fact, that's what the cross is, an incredible collision of His justice and love, His wrath and His grace, all of which colliding together. And so we sacrifice one for the other. For what reason? A lot of times we do it because we're trying to make something more palatable. The gospel's not meant to go down easy. It's liberating when we finally, the sustenance it gives us when we finally take it in is remarkable. But it's like a well-done steak. You gotta chew it, and you gotta chew it, and you gotta chew it. It's almost like our job is to look that person in the eye and go, don't spit it out. Keep chewing it. Because we know it is going to offer sustenance. We know that when it gets in, it's not just going to be God's wrath, God's judgment, God's condemnation. There's still His grace and mercy and justice.
We want to muddy it up with praise. That's what we want to do.
And it's hyper grace. It becomes something that's not even grace at all. It becomes all permissible. There's no justice. There's no wrath. And it nullifies and it softens the cross.
I think that's why Ecclesiastes is so difficult for us to read, because he don't just acknowledge that there's wickedness and there's righteousness and you should do good. He acknowledges judgment too.
Yeah.
But then he turns around and says, "For we're all going to die and it's all going to face the same fate." But I guess he's 900 years early, right? So, like, we want to, I think as Christians, we want to be like, we know what that looks like. But he doesn't go there because, you know.
But notice he also, the time, because he said there's a time for this and a time for that, because there was so much of that towards the beginning, it made, when he said there's a time for judgment, stand out even more. Because we're talking about everyday life, a time for this, a time for that, a time for good, a time for bad. And then there's just a standalone, a time for judgment, when He's going to judge both. And that just seemed to stand out to me far more, maybe because it was a standalone, but because He emphasized there is, in fact, a time when this is going to happen and this is going to happen. And at the end, He culminates and says, and there's a time where this is going to happen. And we've got to make sure, as Christians, we're prepared for it. We're ready. We know that we're not going to be justified because of our works and our deeds. We know that our works, our righteousness, are just filthy rags in the presence of His perfection. But we do know that we are justified because of what Christ has done. But imagine having those filthy rags at the end, at Judgment Day, and trying to hold them up to a perfect, righteous God and say, this is what I've done for you. In fact, I don't even think, if that even were the case, that it were to play out that way, I don't even think they would have the bravery to even show it to them. To see the refinement of God's glory through the salvation of Jesus Christ, and then to go, here are my works, I don't even think we'd push that aside. I don't have anything. Not me. Or at best, go to the next person. Pass. Ecclesiastes is, without a doubt, very difficult to read because there is negativity. But you do see these gems placed in it where he recognizes the good. He knows that there's good. He knows that there's justice. He knows that there's righteousness. But what is he seeing it in the face of? He's seeing it in the face of all the toil and under the sun that is just human beings running up against each other, not working together, functioning apart from God. And again, what does he call that? Meaningless. And so as Christians, what do we take away from that? It certainly is a warning. Don't try and do this apart from Him. You're going to find yourself going down an avenue of meaninglessness. What else? What is this, to wrap up, what does this allow us to take from?
I don't know that I have an answer to your question, but I have another question.
Well, I'll give it a try. There might be a better question. Let's hear it.
Okay, so we talk a lot about purpose and reason and searching for the purpose versus the reason when things, and we always equate that with the negative things or things that aren't going as well. But do we ever ask that question when things are going well? You know, what's the purpose? Why are things going well right now? What, you know, and where is that purpose leading us then?
I guess, I think I had a season of that recently, and I think but the problem was it made me look back to the season where it wasn't fun. So it was kind of like, well, this purpose is because, and so maybe that's not where you're going, but it was like, I'm seeing like last night, Evelyn is just not going to sleep, and usually I just give up and quit real quick because I just don't do crying and whining. It was a time to quit. But I stuck with it for an hour. I tried everything, and it was just, poor baby just doesn't feel good. She just needs to cry it out and go to sleep. But I tried to put her in bed with me. I tried to give her a bottle. I tried to snuggle with her. And it was just, Daddy, I don't feel good. Leave me alone kind of a thing. But I did it. 2 months ago, that wasn't going to happen. 2 months ago, I'm turning the baby monitor off and going, figure it out. But at least I can walk away, the same result's the same. She's going to have to figure it out. But at least I walked away going, I did everything. Everything I can try and figure out. But so much of that comes from that difficult time of pressing in and trying to grow. And so I don't know if that is how it functions, where you just keep getting pulled back to the negative. But yeah, do we think of the purpose when things are good?
But, you know,
Enjoy it.
you can't
Eat, drink, like he said, eat and drink and enjoy.
appreciate a great victory or a good time unless you've had a bad time.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, coming through a real deep valley and then hitting the mountaintop afterward, you really appreciate the mountaintop then.
Yeah.
It helps you not take things for granted. And especially if you've gone through this cycle several times in your life.
Yeah. Which it seems like that's just what it's going to be.
That's what it's going to be, for the most part. And you appreciate those high times, and it gives you hope when you're in the low times.
And so my encouragement to you is this. He's very clear that there's a time for this and time for that. Good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. Back and forth it goes, right? In those times of the valley, my prayer is that that is where you experience God and know that He's there in His sustaining grace. And when you're on those mountaintops, it's a time where you bask in His glory and His mercy, having brought you out of that. And I hope that is my deepest prayer for you, because we all have to be drawn back to Him. I erased it. It's got to be God-centered. If it's God-centered, then we're going to constantly be coming back to Him, not when we get on the mountains, now we're trying to do it alone. Oh, now we're back in the valley. All right, God, I'm here. What do you need, God? Now I'm back on a mountain. No, now I'll do it myself. That's going to fall under meaninglessness. Any final thoughts?